Welcome to the Nation ASEAN Plus. I'm Nadia Abdulatif. As the 47th ASEAN Summit enters its second day here in Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre, this hour we take a look at this discussion, ASEAN's economic future, driving growth through unity and innovation. Joining me is Intan Nadia Jalil, Regional Head of Group Economic and Market Analysis at CIMB. Now, before we start our discussion, we now take a live look at Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre where the 47th ASEAN Summit is taking place. Jessie Sahal is on ground with the latest update. Jessie, over to you.
Thanks, studio. I'm currently at the Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre. We are on level 3. Perched in this media pit area. It's a designated area for local, regional and international media. We're now being told for cameras to move towards the other end of the hall. Level 3, right on my side here, is the designated area for the Prime Minister's makeshift office for ASEAN. Behind me, the KLCC Twin Towers, of course, a pristine and picturesque area for the 47th ASEAN Summit to be held. Behind me at this point of time is where the RCEP meeting is currently taking place, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We do expect the leaders to walk out of that meeting and then jump into another meeting in just a couple of minutes, and that is the East Asia Summit. Now, you may say, what does this mean for the rest of us? What does this mean for the world? Well, it shows that ASEAN's relevance at this point is rising by hosting major powers. And this is a point in time where global players are no longer dictating to ASEAN. It is ASEAN that is engaging with them for better conversation. Now, for businesses and governments, this message is clear. Southeast Asia is where the next set of rules will be written in terms of trade, supply chains, and regional architecture. Now, diplomatically, ASEAN is leveraging to carve out its own path rather than simply orbit around some of the superpowers. And I speak of global superpowers, some of whom were here, have just left the country earlier this morning, but some superpowers and their leaders are still within these walls of KLCC. Now, the East Asia Summit, that will comprise of now 18 plus 1 member, that is the new ASEAN member Timor-Leste, sitting in for that meeting as well. Basically, it's ASEAN state members with the other 8 members or strategic partners, that being Australia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, New Zealand, and the United States. This will help to boost ASEAN's global credibility by showing that leaders are committed to deliver on trade, security, and not just talk or not just diplomacy. Now, the ministers who are sitting in those meetings and moving into the East Asia Summit meeting shortly are under immense pressure. They have to deliver. They have to be sure that they can turn this summit momentum into measurable outcomes, because global attention is truly high, and it's high time to see that follow-through come through as well. Now, the balance they strike today could determine whether ASEAN remains a strategic pivot, if we can really walk the talk, or do we then be left being overshadowed by larger powers. I think the past few days has really shown us that ASEAN is here to stay under the leadership of Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. He has risen with ASEAN powers to show the rest of the world that we have a voice, we have identity, and we have a vision. We're still waiting for some movement behind me. We just wanted to bring you the very latest from what's happening on the ground here. As you can see, press are waiting with bated breath for any sighting of foreign ministers, other diplomats, delegates, and commissions that have been here at the summit so far. A lot of new discussion points and conversations coming out of ASEAN today. The thick of it, the highlight, of course, yesterday with the meeting to sign the Kuala Lumpur Peace Accord that was witnessed by the US President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim between Thailand and Cambodia. Also, of course, Timor-Leste's accession as the 11th ASEAN member. And very importantly, the conversation continues, albeit being slow, but it is continuing on Myanmar's 5-point consensus. Well, so far, that's the latest I have for for you. Be sure that I am stationed here with of course, very much excitement and interest to bring you whatever latest I can. Do expect more from me later in the day and tomorrow. So we're in the thick of the ASEAN Summit, but we do hope to bring you more updates. Bernama.com has all the latest information. Our media is stationed at the International Media Center, and we're writing those articles as we speak. I'll chat with you in a short while. It's back to you, studio.
Exciting last few days leading up to the summit, as well as where we're at right now. Of course, a lot of updates coming up from social media yesterday, especially with President Trump's arrival. Now, when we talk about ASEAN's economic future, and at the end of the day, the truth is in the pudding. Whatever that's signed or whatever that's being discussed in the next few days, really what's going to determine whether this is going to be really impactful is what happens after, or what happens in the negotiation. Now, how can ASEAN strengthen its unity among member states, knowing that now we've got 11 states, and to ensure that collective and inclusive economic growth is actually not only integrated but sustainable across the region?
Thank you for that very easy question. I'm sure it requires a very short answer. I jest. And I think from that question, I think what I would like to say is I'm grateful that my vocation is as an economist and observer of the goings on. I don't envy the policymakers in ASEAN regarding their role in strengthening ASEAN, as well as recognizing that ASEAN is actually, by size, the third largest economic bloc in the world. I think we have to remember that. But in order for it to be able to exert its strength and power as the third largest economic bloc in the world, ASEAN itself has to act as one economic bloc. So what I would be interested to observe within these next few days, because as you know, there's the main discussion and the main summit, but sometimes the more important agreements happen at the sides. What I would like to see is movements with regards to, one, the ASEAN economic community, because it's very difficult for ASEAN to act as one single bloc without actually acting as one single economic bloc. I mean, there has been some moves towards that, but from the report card that was published by the ASEAN Secretariat recently, there are still many areas in which ASEAN needs to progress. Obviously, one being in terms of movement of labour, as well as capital across our borders. I think the other area of progress that would be interesting to see is in terms of how ASEAN itself negotiates as a bloc with all of its strategic partners, right? It's always been the ASEAN experience, or rather the ASEAN principle of consensus and acting as now 11 countries as opposed to a single bloc. By contrast, the EU, as we know, is a single economic community, is a single market, has a single currency, and actually has its own EU governing body in the EU Central Bank. So it's a completely different block of countries than ASEAN is. And ASEAN has always operated from a different set of principles than that. I would say, however, that if ASEAN is actually to achieve or rather meet its potential as, again, the third largest economic bloc in the world, it has to move towards some level of unity in that sense. And I think it's important, for one, for ASEAN to actually recognize that the diversity within its 11 members, we have one of the most populous countries in the world.
Yes.
We have also one of the least populous countries in the world.
Yes.
We have a global financial center. We have countries that are still developing, right? And Malaysia is smack dab in the middle, I think. We're in the middle in terms of population growth. We're in the middle in terms of economic size, but that's in terms of population size as well. We're third in terms of GDP per capita. So Malaysia has a very central role in ASEAN, regardless if it holds the presidency or chairmanship or not. So in essence, it has to recognize that diversity is actually its strength. I think since the pandemic, what's happened is there's a larger recognition, a larger need within the world's, or the global manufacturing and production community, that there should be a shift towards localization and regionalization of production centers that should benefit ASEAN if we all act as one market.
Definitely. And we were talking about this the last time when you were here, when we talked about unity in diversity and understanding that all of the different countries are starting at different starting point.
Correct.
And while we do want to move in the general direction that is similar, I think there are some catch-up games that are necessary. And I think really how each country is able to enable the other to be able to open up non-policy or regimented barriers are really going to see how we're going to move forward. Now, I'd like to quote something that came up from Vietnam's Prime Minister yesterday when we're talking about the principle of unity in diversity and the fact that it lies at the heart of the ASEAN's model. So he says that ASEAN is a community which grows strong with each member state and as they grow strong. Now, how do you interpret this in practical terms? Because you were talking about the fact that we need to reconcile things like national interest, which I think is key.
Yes.
And of course, regional integration, but we still have differences in taxation, differences in digital regulation, cross-border investments. You mentioned labor mobility. So if we were to kind of just zoom down on maybe one or two things that we can do to kickstart this, what would that be in your thought?
Well, firstly, and this has always been a personal interest of mine, I would say, is, or rather something that I always have to mention when we talk about ASEAN. We really need to strengthen the ASEAN Secretariat.
Right.
Right, because they're the ones who are actually doing all the work. The ASEAN Secretariat is based in Jakarta. I think it's funded by all the ASEAN countries. Yes. And whatever ASEAN does, whatever agreements that ASEAN achieves, the operationalization of those agreements are going to be done by the ASEAN Secretariat.
And
they're the ones working behind the scenes.
Contrary to what we actually see. So a lot of people assume that on the one hand we've got you, which is seen as more homogenous, which is not necessarily true. And then we have ASEAN.
Definitely not true actually from
exactly.
reality.
And then we've got also what's coming out of ASEAN Secretariat. I think some of the critique that has come out is whether or not we can get the ASEAN Secretariat to move up to have teeth in some of the things that they're doing.
Exactly. I think the key to that is really funding. Right. At some point, sometimes the ASEAN Secretariat can find itself under capacity, or should I say over capacity, when it comes to the work that it has to do. Because considering the fact that it has all these 11 countries now to monitor and observe, as well as help the lesser developed countries in terms of operationalizing their own ASEAN agreements and how to meet up to their ASEAN commitments, and as well as all the actual research that needs to be done in order to ensure that the agreements that ASEAN does sign and commit to actually benefit all of ASEAN. So that's a big ask actually, and I think the team is actually small but mighty, but it really needs help in terms of its capacity and its resources.
Definitely. And I think moving forward, passing the baton of the chairmanship from Malaysia to Philippines is going to be another interesting thing to see, because as we've discussed yesterday, in fact, with Ambassador Brian Mafitas as well and Dr. Tan Chi Meng, some of the conversation is a lot of ASEAN is also to do with who's chairing ASEAN for that term. So what are some of the things that you foresee might be that, pivot or that little inch of growth in the next chairmanship if Malaysia is able to set the stage nicely, because it's trying to play as neutral a party as it can. Yes. But we know now that the next chairman may not necessarily have the same views on every single thing. So what are some of the things perhaps incoming that we should also be aware of?
Oh, now you want me to move into geopolitics, which is completely not my wheelhouse. I look at it as a hobby and as an observer. Obviously, it depends on the leadership of the country that's chairing ASEAN as well. I think from past experience and observation and current trends, what we can see is the Philippines has other priorities compared to Malaysia when it comes to regional cooperation and when it comes to its relationship with the superpowers, for instance, US and China. We don't know what might transpire out of that. Hopefully, the incoming chairman or chairperson can actually recognize again what the Vietnamese Prime Minister mentioned: unity in diversity. That's wholly important. Divided we fall, united. Hopefully, we can get through this extremely
Bersatu
interesting
teguh
time.
bercerai roboh,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Literally, and we are seeing that coming up from Malaysia's chairmanship. In fact, not only the hospitality that we're showing, but at least still that firm stand that ASEAN does stand for something, and we may not necessarily agree on everything, but we can be diplomatic with each other. We can have professional conversations on what needs to move forward. Now, when we're talking about ASEAN leveraging on digital connectivity, I remember we spoke about earlier about how young this regional bloc is with 680 million people. We've got one of the largest penetrations of the internet and digital consumers in the world. Now, if we talk about digital connectivity and AI innovation, what are some of the things that you'd like to see in enhancing and accelerating? Because we were talking to Dr. Jasmine Begum earlier, and she was really drilling down on ASEAN accelerating the opportunity in this space. So what are your thoughts?
I always think that any opportunity within the artificial intelligence space has to be based on a foundation of real and original intelligence. Right, we have to make sure that the infrastructure is there, not just in terms of hardware, in terms of obviously all the digital infrastructure, cables, etc., are commensurate with the need or with whatever is required to power such technology, but also in terms of the software, and that includes institutions. Are our institutions ready for whatever developments that AI can present to us? And AI presents both opportunities, as we know, but also challenges, as we know. And it's always the case that regulation tends to play catch up with technology. I think that's always, you always need to be cognizant of that. There should always be this focus that, yes, AI, again, a tool, but not the be-all and end-all. I think that should be the focus. And I think at the ASEAN level, there are recognitions that, AI will present these opportunities, but also the challenges in terms of competitive regulations. How do we manage AI in terms of its content, in terms of our young people's exposure to AI?
Because we keep talking
data protection, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, we are looking at 11 countries that have various levels of development, both in terms of infrastructure and institutions. And I think if we had a strengthened ASEAN Secretariat, they could help to bridge those gaps.
Definitely.
Right?
And I think what we're seeing just now, there were some visuals that were shared earlier about Malaysia's 5G plans, and I think that was in Langkawi. That clip was from Langkawi. But there was also talking about 5G across ASEAN, what that might look like in future. And I think to be an equalizer, as you rightly pointed out, there has to be obviously safeguards to ensure that while we do want to chase the next big thing, it's not a situation where policy plays catch up. And we have seen this quite a bit, not only in our country, but also across the region. So when we're talking about innovation that balances sustainability, innovation that propels the region forward, but is also deeply respectful and rooted in the understanding that there has to be social well-being and there has to be environmental governance and preservation and conservation and everything else along with it.
When you speak about AI, for instance, I mean, that's a very huge issue right now in terms of the data centers that are required to power these AI engines, right? I mean, we know for a fact that the Google data centers in the US, for instance, have created sort of water supply deserts in a way, because they require such a huge amount of water and resources
to cool the data
centers down. And in that case, I mean, if we're talking about technological advancements, that could be an area that could be explored within ASEAN in order to create more sustainable...
I'm going to cut you there. As we see, we have the Prime Minister who is actually making his way. That is the Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre. There will be a discussion on the East ASEAN Summit happening today. And of course, our friends from the press at Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre have got their hands full. This is going to begin shortly, and they will be sharing the updates as we go along. There you have Prime Minister Tuan Rumah. The host with the most.
The host with the most.
Definitely the host with the most. Now, what we're seeing coming out of not only the discussions that have happened, and of course, if you mentioned cooling of data centers, that can be a session in itself. I think I went down the rabbit hole of understanding what is the climate footprint of our single question on ChatGPT and on AI, and I'm very sure this last few weeks leading up to ASEAN, the number of questions not only coming from the press, but of course coming from the public on what is ASEAN all about. And every single question, people don't realize every single question actually has a carbon footprint, has an environmental impact.
And the more polite you are with ChatGPT or DeepSeek or whatever, the higher the carbon
longer
footprint,
the
longer
sentence,
it has
the
to
longer
pass.
the
It's
carbon
ridiculous.
footprint.
It's getting a bit ridiculous. So I think we always need to remember that the intelligence is still artificial, right?
Yes.
As much as we can get excited about, and we should. It's a great resource to have. It really needs to be rooted again in original human intelligence.
Do you think we have the right governance in place, or can we put the governance in place fast enough? I mean, I remember Rajvin talking during our Belanjawan budget saying that yes, there is a footprint, but that footprint is not necessarily one that I suppose is to be worried about because it hasn't exploded into an exponential number. However, I do see that it is an incoming challenge and something that ASEAN needs to be aware of, really realizing that we are actually perhaps the regional bloc that's using it the most at the moment.
Quite possibly, yes. I think, again, because regulation always has to catch up with technology, and when it comes to these digital technologies, they move at such an exponential rate that it would not benefit us to sort of put that question aside and go like, okay, we'll sort it out when there's a problem. Because there are already problems that we can see from other parts of the world, right? We talked about AI psychosis, for instance. I mean, these are actual real possibilities, and we have seen, I think, of late, cases where
more and more of
it, but it's not just AI. It's in terms of internet penetration with our young. I mean, how that's impacted the mental health.
Sadly,
yes, very sadly, and it's not new. That's the thing. It's not new, and it's something that we really need to be cognizant of. I don't envy parents of this generation because you and I grew up before there was the internet, right? But now, I mean, it's unheard of to not have access to the internet and to not have access to this wealth of information and misinformation, unfortunately. And parents have to be vigilant about it, but society and the governments have to be vigilant about it as well.
Now, since you're talking about the young, and ASEAN is a very young regional bloc, let's talk about education system, right? We know that the ASEAN education system needs to very quickly adapt to a future-ready workforce. And we are not only talking about low-value, low-skill type of workforce, we need to cover that whole entire supply chain that not only talks about high-tech, but also people with correct life skills, the correct soft skills, the correct TVET skills, and we mentioned this at length when we last met. But what are some of the areas that perhaps we can focus on for Malaysia and for countries, for example, that have just joined us, like Timor-Leste, for example, in driving a future-ready workforce that is able to perhaps even contribute to ASEAN, not just nationally?
I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that ASEAN interests and national interests are not mutually exclusive.
Yes.
Right? As long we need to be able to work towards ASEAN interests at large and see that anything that benefits ASEAN will benefit each of its member countries and to work towards that. And not have these sort of what I would call non-productive competition between countries.
Can you give me an example of what a non-productive competition would be here?
Well, for one thing, I think sometimes because of the fact that ASEAN members are able to negotiate trade agreements on their own, they can be taken advantage of by larger and more better equipped. I'm being factual. Yes, I mean, they can be taken advantage of by superpowers because they like to, we can have an ASEAN level agreement discussion on one hand, and then at the same time, these countries would have parallel bilateral agreements on the other, and that's how they kind of divide and conquer. I think it needs to be recognized that there is that capacity gap between ASEAN countries as well as ASEAN as a bloc and whatever superpower that they're negotiating with. So the thing that I would like to caution is that ASEAN very much is like pelanduk antara dua gajah.
Right.
The pelanduk can either recognize that it needs to work, it needs to operate on its strengths, leverage its strength in terms of its agility, its ability to move away adapt, but it cannot take sides.
Definitely.
Right? So we have to recognize that should be the operational reality. So when we're talking about human resources, for instance, I mentioned the movement on labour. I think that's something that really needs to be addressed at the ASEAN level, because whatever it is, because of climate change, because of economic circumstances, migration and intra-migration is always going to be an issue in ASEAN. So it's very interesting to me whenever a group of countries have free movement of goods and capital across their borders, but not talk about the free movement of labour. I think that's one area that is always like the lacuna when it comes to
I think over the last few
blocks.
years, what we've seen is individual countries have also strengthened what their labour laws is, especially including the movement of their otherwise an export of talent. We've seen Philippines do this. We've seen Indonesia also trying to do this in its relationship with Malaysia. And I think it remains to be seen how we're going to move forward. Now, very quickly, how can ASEAN ensure that smaller economies are not left behind? I mean, we know that we've got Timor-Leste that have joined us, but we've also got other economies that I suppose in a way are comparable in the ASEAN group, for example, Laos, etc. So how do we ensure that we don't leave anyone behind?
First, we have to recognize that we don't. That should be one of the founding principles of ASEAN, that no one should be left behind, and to recognize that certain countries need more help than other countries in order for ASEAN to be able to leverage on its strengths, this unity and within diversity principle, right? So that's the first thing. And second, we need commitments from better equipped ASEAN members or better resourced ASEAN members to put their money where their mouth is.
Oh yeah.
Essentially, right? And in that case, you really need that commitment, and that's the first step. That's a very much needed step, and the recognition that in order for all these lovely statements to come to fruition, in order to be realized, actual commitment needs to be taken.
I'm writing that down. We need to ensure that lovely statements turn into fruition and we take action, and ensure that really when we talk about no one left behind, we walk the talk. Now that's all the time that we have on the Nation ASEAN Plus today. Thank you so much, Nadia, Jalil, for joining us, not only for your compelling insights, but also today the challenge of ASEAN is not just about economic growth, but also smart growth, as she's mentioned, integrating markets, embracing innovation and strengthening unity while respecting member diversity. For Malaysia, of course, it's clear that the neighbours and the opportunity is large. Shape the next chapter of the Southeast Asian economic story. And for more updates on ASEAN developments, visit the ASEAN page on Bernama.com or keep it logged on to Bernama TV for the latest on what's happening at the summit. Now, before we go, we leave you with these joyful visuals of Timor-Leste officially acceding to the ASEAN as its 11th member state during the opening ceremony of the 47th ASEAN Summit and related summits yesterday, fulfilling the nation's 14th year aspiration. There were tears yesterday as we watched this. I'm Nadia Abdulatif, and this is Nadia Jalil, and this has been the Nation ASEAN Plus. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.